and welcome to the Art of Creation show. I am your host, Rebecca Boswell, and today we are going to have an interview, which is something that we haven't had since the end of last year. This is kicking off season 9 of the Art of Creation show. 7 and 8, we had read-alongs, so if you missed those at the end of 2019, you are welcome to go back and listen. I read a couple books to you, and they were really awesome. So you can go find those in the archives. And now, season 9, we're back to interviews, and what better topic? February is the month of love, according to everyone who celebrates Valentine's Day. And so we're going to be looking at love. And today, to help kick off the season and this conversation, love and the material world, we have none other than the beautiful Maggie Emerson to join us. She, if you are not familiar with her, and I think you probably would want to go back and see the previous episode with her from the Art of Creation show. We'll put the link in the show notes. But if you haven't seen that and you have not been introduced to her yet, she is amazing. She is a mompreneur, adventurer, liver of life, and wise soul. So Maggie, it is wonderful to have you here with us today to have this conversation, and welcome.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's you and I have talked a little bit about this too. And okay, so here's a series on love. And, you know, there are all these things, mostly from song lyrics that kind of pop into my head, like, you know, like, what's love got to do with it? And, you know, all kinds of other little like love quote snippets from the popular realm. And, you know, I have the sense that love, and you hear this in so many places. I think my earphones are hitting my head. Excuse me. Like, we talk about love all the time, right? I love this chicken sandwich, right? I love these new shoes that I bought. I love my child. I love this new lover in my life. I love that color car. I mean, like, there's all these different things, from super superficial to somewhat visceral to including our whole experience as a mind, body, spirit entity. Well, we use this one word for it. And, you know, when we try to look at this big gangly thing, I think it can be a little cumbersome, and it puts a lot of pressure on one little word. So today when we are talking, I'm just wondering if we can give some sort of frame, right? Like, I don't know that we can actually define love. Like, I don't know that that's actually possible, right? I think it's sort of like the old, you know, blind men and the elephant thing, right? Like, it really depends on what part you're perceiving at the moment. But just for the frame of this conversation, and when you're working with clients, when you are tapped into your best self, you know, what are some kind of loose guidelines that you would use, that we can use in this conversation, for what is love even, and what is it even that we're starting to point to with this conversation?
Yeah, that's a big question,
right?
Yes. Well, I guess you hit on it a bit, like a bit, and like in all ways, is like, for me there's a sensation, right? Mm-hmm. It's almost as if my world gets bigger energetically, you know, and I would say that, and the other piece, if you're aware of your body, it's kind of like with love, it's kind of melty. Like, I even look at when my kiddo tells me I'll do something funny, and then he's like, Mom, I love you. And he just, like, there's a softness to it. There's, you know, it's the walls go down, and there's like an all-encompassing warmth to it, is how I would say it. Yeah.
So there's you know, there are lots of right, like John Lennon told us already, all you need is love, right? And, you know, that's based on many different historical traditions, historical in terms of, from religious perspectives, from spiritual perspectives, from just philosophical perspectives. But this sense that, like, somewhere kind of binding everything together. There is
Mm-hmm.
this, oneness or love source. In Buddhism, you'd call it loving kindness. Um, and it just sort of permeates everything, right? It's kind of what makes you and I and, this table, my desk and that tree and everything part of the same soup, kind of.
Yeah.
So when we look at that, it's like, I feel like it gets kind of conceptual, right? Like we can think, oh, okay, we are all one. But then we go out into the material world. We go out into the grocery store or our kids' school, where everyone's going crazy for, whatever shared experience they're trying to create together with all these, screaming kids. And it seems like sometimes it can be challenging to bring those things together, to really overlap, to say, hey, that love, that oneness, that possible reality is always there, even when, or like now with political climates as they are, right, where there seems so much division and separateness and polarization, right? Like, how do we take this concept, whether you believe in God or the universe or just that there is good in the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do we take that and still like go out into all the chaos and the turmoil and the different points of view and still stay connected to that?
Yeah. So what keeps popping too is it's like our bodies, right? We have
Yes.
something called fascia
Uh-huh.
that lines our entire body, and there can be chaos in our bellies and there can be chaos in our hearts or whatever it is, and it still functions. So in terms of taking that out in the world, it's coming back home to you.
Mm.
And when, it's more and more when you're actually like truly honest with yourself, because there's a difference. And even like I have to catch myself multiple times of like, is this really true? Like, am I being honest with myself? But when we're true with ourselves, we can go out in the world and see the world, like even with our differences, as simply just that, our differences. Whereas when we're all tied up in like not very content within, then someone who's having a tough day that gives you a look that on any other normal day would just be like, oh, just a look, it becomes like a look and it's bad, or something can be said and the spiral goes on. But when we go from within, it really, that's the magic.
Yeah.
Right, that's what creates the oneness, because we're what often happens is we disconnect from ourselves first.
Yeah.
But
And
yeah.
that's where we go into sometimes the story or the mental aspect of it. Like I'm just, when you're speaking, I'm just thinking about, years and years ago, I don't even remember where I first heard it. Jack Canfield, but it was probably like Bob Proctor. I don't know, some back there. It was way back there. But the whole concept of, how would you like to go through your life? And do you want to go through your life such that everything is a challenge and everyone's out to get you? Or would you like to go through your life as though everything and everyone is actually conspiring in your favor?
Yeah.
And so when you're saying that, that is what really pops into my head about, like, it's kind of that presence of being here and now with what is, and then also having almost that internal vigilance of recognizing where we are slipping into a mental dialogue that might pull us out of that natural sense of presence and connection with all the things that are around us.
Absolutely.
What would you say to that?
I know, I was like, absolutely, because it is that, I call it stalking myself.
Oh, cool.
Right.
Oh,
So
that's
I'll stalk myself and notice, like, it's funny, this week in dance class, I was here. I wasn't that, like, here. And I kept working, like it felt like I was working hard to connect back in. And sometimes it's like, okay, that we have these energy leaks, so to say, right? Where our mind goes and the mind rats and the, like all that stuff, which is what creates like, you know, the Eeyore cloud.
Yes.
Right.
Funny.
And so yeah, that whole piece that, I know you said, I can't remember exactly your words, but that internal check-in is what can create the shift. And
Yeah.
it actually takes quite a bit of courage and willingness to see you for you,
Mhm.
like, but and not judge it, because
Yeah.
we all have our little things, right? I just actually witnessed myself get like, I don't think I've ever been that, like, there's very few things that get me so fired up I'm shaking.
Mm.
I had that occur yesterday,
Mm.
and I had to really check in, right? And like notice, be loving to me in my space, be loving to the what happened, that, or what, I don't want to say what happened, but what was created. So I
Yeah.
had to look inside to be like, okay, I created this, right? In this, even though like one could look at what occurred as somebody doing something to me, I'm like, no, this was created. And I get like, it's, whether it was for me to step into a role of being loving, but including myself in that loving by
Mm-hmm.
being very clear.
Yeah.
So it's that, you know, it's, again, I come like, it starts with you, love on you, even whether
Yeah.
you're mad. I used to think being angry was such a bad thing,
Yeah.
right? Or like having that energy. The faster you're okay with it, it doesn't really exist.
Yeah. It's just
Yeah.
potency. And then
Yeah.
the question is, do you overlay judgment? And if so, then like what does that create? As opposed to just having a flare up and then being done, right?
Yeah. Like
And just
noticing.
learning from
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Like noticing the, you know, the,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
so to say,
Yeah.
however it comes up for you.
Yeah.
And then, whew, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that whole thing of like love in the material world too, right? It's that thing of like, how often do we like, we're moving and grooving, we're feeling good, we're loving everyone, everything, ourselves. We step out into the world and all of a sudden it's about the world. And you just mentioned it, which is great. You know, we cut off from ourselves. And if we cut off from ourselves, if that's actually the tether to right, to all of the goodies, all of the oneness, then yeah, how do we think we can stay in that broader expansion, in that broader space of love, whatever that is, right? If we've already closed off from ourselves,
Right.
because that's sort of our gateway through it. That's the part of it that we actually can know the easiest, I guess. Like we know what this is like, and yet we, in some ways, it almost seems like it's the hardest thing to love and to know, right? I mean, I know lots of people who would say like, well, it's actually easier for me to love my child, or
Mm-hmm.
it's easier for me to know my spouse, right? As opposed to love ourselves or to know ourselves.
Right. And I will say, I'm gonna, they have two big things that are like, I
Yes.
want to, yeah. So one is like that's the misconception of like, it's easier to love our kids. It's actually the depth of being able to love your kid, your partner, your spouse, whatever, is far greater when you love you. Like
Yes.
there's, it's like, I'm a living testimony of it. Right. Like,
Yes.
like it really, like I used to think that I had to pour into my kid and then I could fill up, which is, I think, a lot of what mamas tend to do, even some papas, you know, or women, men, people, right? We
Yeah.
think we have to pour in order to feel good enough, to feel of value, to feel worth. But it's like, the sooner you can flip it
Yeah.
to pouring into you, there's so much more to give.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
like the depth. Well, it's sort of like, I've heard sometimes in Buddhism where when they're talking about the middle way, right? And the farther that you swing out in the one direction, that's sort of the farther then you might swing out into the other direction in order to kind of find that middle. But in this case, it's kind of a different way of looking at it. But in this case, it's kind of like, the greater your capacity for self-love here, it's actually the greater for your capacity out in the world. So, so we think that no, it all has to be out there. And yet the
Mm-hmm.
more we can love and trust and be with this space, we're able to give all of that, right? We can actually only love another as much as we're willing to love within.
It's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
That's
we can
it.
fool ourselves.
Yeah, of course.
Like we're good at that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and that, it just, I feel like for those, like the listeners, like really let that sink in. Like what, like imagine what you sense of, like even what you receive from others. Cause it really is a receiving game too. A game, adventure,
Yeah.
journey, right? In that receiving from oneself, I know my personal experience, it's been tough to receive from myself and to honor myself in my journey. But it, like a flip has really switched lately, and it just is in all the other little things, or even like we talk about the material world, right?
Mm.
um I noticed myself yesterday in my like in my moments of right, that I wanted to just go buy something. I was at the grocery store picking up very specific things, and I wanted to go to the like the candles and the creams section. Not that I did, like, not that I like, you know, I very well could get that, but it was an energetic impulse to
Mm-hmm.
fill, to avoid
Yeah.
what I really was feeling. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and it's so interesting too, right? Because like here it's Valentine's Day, right? And so, right, we have this holiday that's based on love, right? But then it's actually all about material things, right? And even when
Right.
it's about romance, it's almost like romance is sort of like the material aspect of actual love, right? Because it's more of like what you put on with another person as opposed to communion, connection, honoring, right? Like all these things.
Yeah. Well, I think the most hilarious meme that's been going around is like something about posting your flowers on Facebook to let everybody know you're special.
Yeah.
And it's like, what if you didn't need to do that? Like, it's one thing, it's lovely. Like, I love seeing that people are being loved and adored. Awesome. But
Yeah.
it's interesting that we have to pick one day a year to make
Yes.
sure
Yeah.
that it's done, you know?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So I would love to know, and I know we're doing sort of an abbreviated in and out kind of episode today. But you know, I know that you have this wonderful community of unstoppable mamas that you work with,
Yeah.
right? And um, who doesn't want more flow in their life and their business and to tap into their intuition and knowing it? So I love what you're doing there. And I love also that you have, this arc, right? From burnout to badass, which is, I think, all about tapping into the greater love and also receiving it, as you mentioned, and kind of processing it within, through, and around yourself so that you can actually be that greater force in the world. Um, so what would you say for people who are listening? Like, what is the number one thing? Where do you start when you're like, okay, something has to give? I want to reconcile this by actually just being full out in my world from this place of love. Um, what's the first step in going from burnout to badass?
Well, it's being honest with yourself, really. Is
Yeah.
I like to call it, you zoom out and take a bird's eye view of your world,
Yeah.
and you start, you can, you could cat it if you want, relationship, kids, money, whatever, but zoom out in all areas. And one, you're going to notice the different energies when you look, just say you look at relationship and you're like, right? Or maybe you look at relationship and you're like, yeah, damn straight, I got that one, right?
Yeah.
Whatever it is. And then once you kind of get that, it's like, my favorite question to ask and to share is like, what are you saying yes to that you really want to say no to?
Mm.
And what are you saying no to that you really want to say yes to? And really get clear, like, because it's like so many things. Like, here's a side note. I was looking at the money piece of my world, right? And I kept thinking I do want to build my own house one day, but I actually got super honest with myself. And right now I just want to stack the money. Right. And so it's getting like, I was able to get on because it was feeling so wonky for such a period of time, but I'm like, I'm on the track. Right. And we get to this thing where we think it has to look a certain way because I'm at a certain age, I have a kiddo, my man and I are coming together to live in the same home. So we needed to get on that right away.
Mm.
No way. Like,
Yeah.
that wasn't me being honest with myself. Right. And so that being said, it just flipped the energy of it all.
Yeah.
And then it becomes a fluid thing and things start to flow in. Right. And so, yeah, back to I'm like where we start with those points that I said. But if you really back it up even more, it's like you stop making yourself wrong for anything that isn't working.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's, and can be sometimes really challenging. We all have those areas of our worlds that, so far from my experience of who I've worked with, right, and myself,
Yes.
there's some areas that come really easy, and there's some areas that
Yeah.
get to be played with and discovered in a different way.
Yeah. So that whole sense of choice creates, and if something that you created is not working, you can choose again.
Yeah.
Even though I know, like, even for myself, there are certain areas where I'm like, yeah, except for that.
Yeah,
Like, I can't change that. And it's like, well, and where can we actually make different choices, even if it's within a larger choice that we don't see yet how we could make that change. Sometimes the smaller choices that we start to make within the bigger choices can start to create a little bit more room to where things start to change enough to where, like, all of a sudden, oh, it looks different, right? And it's changed on its own, or you can see another avenue that wasn't available before.
Very much so. And it's celebrating those little things and knowing that if something even subtle changes, it can change.
Yeah.
I think that's the piece too. It's because especially with mamas, it feels like, the mater, I'm saying that wrong, not mater, that's the cartoon. Martyr.
Mater.
Mater. Martyr.
Yes.
Martyr. We like, I've had to train myself to let my son take care of some chores because sometimes it's just easier to do it myself. Yeah. But in the long run, you got to like cast out to the future. So that's the zoom out too of like, what are you creating for your future? Well, yeah. I want my kid to not go out in the world and not be able to like have the basics.
Yes. Yeah. Knowing how to actually navigate, maneuver, and interact with the material world, right? Yeah. And see where we actually have, where our choice creates and where sometimes you need to let things kind of come to see, okay, wait, what's next? And then make a choice. But if we're always doing it for them, they're not learning how to navigate that on their own. And, talk about, if you want to call it self-love or self-empowerment or whatever, but this thing of tapping into, really like that universal belonging, which is kind of another way of pointing out that love thing. It's about knowing you're going to be okay. And part of that is knowing that you can handle whatever shows up. And part of that is having experiences where you have maybe not handled things so well, but then you still survived, right? So learning that process of like, oh, I fell. Oh, but I'm not dead. Oh, okay. And next time I might trip or I might even fall again, but I'm still going to be okay. And each time I learn, and then at some point, maybe I see the hole coming before I fall into it and I walk around it. Right.
Again, that self-awareness piece. It's huge.
Yeah.
Like it's so huge. Yeah.
So Maggie, how can people find you if they want to play more with you?
They can find me either at Maggie-Emerson.com, which is my website. And then also the easiest way is Unstoppable Mamas. If you search that in Facebook, you will find that and you can jump into that group. And you can find me on Facebook too, but the website and Unstoppable Mamas.
Awesome.
Are your go-to.
Yes. And people can join that group and
it's free, and I go live Monday through Friday in there with like, sometimes they're short and like poignant because it's just like boom, here we go. And sometimes they're longer. Okay. But it's a really cool resource for this sort of thing of like, okay, so shit's hitting the fan.
Yeah.
What to do,
Yeah. Don't stand downwind. Move to the side. That's awesome. Okay, great. Well, Maggie, thank you so much for chatting with us today. Before we close, is there any last nugget or word of wisdom that you just want to share?
Yes. And first of all, thank you so much for having me. And my words of wisdom is to trust those things that don't make sense. When you get that little, like I call them little whispers or little like nudges that don't make sense, but it's like this really strong, weird sensation or maybe an image in your head, trust it.
Cool. Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Maggie. I really
Yeah.
appreciate it. I hope you're staying warm up in Colorado, and you're not too buried in snow.
No, not where I'm at.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you again for being here. All of you watching at home, thank you so much for participating. And you certainly can reach out to Maggie and myself on this topic. And yeah, until next week, I wonder what we'll discover next. Thank you guys so much for playing. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.